Welcome to the Arlington Street Church podcast. Founded in 1729, Arlington Street continues today as a gathering place for progressive people of faith in the greater Boston area and beyond. We are located at the corner of Arlington and Boylston Streets, across from the Public Garden in Boston, Massachusetts. Please visit ascboston.org for more information about this historic Unitarian Universalist congregation. Arlington Street Church, gathered in love and service for justice and peace.
We lit our chalice together today with words from Maston Kipp. Ultimately, the measure of your spiritual progress is not in your vocabulary or in your altar design. It's not in how much you pray or meditate. It's not in how much yoga you do or how alkaline your body is. At the end of the day, do others feel loved in your presence? This is the spiritual bottom line. I've always taken comfort in these words, particularly the measure of your spiritual progress is not in how much yoga you do or how alkaline your body is. I've often found many positions of Western yoga uncomfortable and at times even unnatural. And I have no idea how alkaline my body is, but I'm assuming not very, because from a quick Google search, I've learned that low alkaline or highly acidic foods include many processed snacks, certain tropical fruit juices, and hot chocolate, all of which are staples in my diet. But fear not. At the end of the day, do others feel loved in your presence? This is the spiritual bottom line. Whenever I return to this excerpt, often there is momentary relief until it dawns on me that Kipp's spiritual bottom line is not all that easy either. Do others feel loved in your presence? It actually might just be easier to cut out the processed snacks and hot chocolate. Today, I invite you to join me in exploring one way that we might leave others feeling more seen, more heard, more affirmed, and ultimately more loved. And that is through being a good steward of each other's stories. In the moments that the story is shared with us and in how the story travels with us once entrusted to our care. We have probably all come across the phrase stewardship before. We've heard people call themselves stewards of our planet. Maybe we've cheered ourselves on to be better stewards of our public lands. Stewardship can be talked about in secular ways, as you might hear from the Bureau of Land Management or the National Park Service perspective, and it can also be talked about in religious ways as well. From the UU religious perspective, we might say something like, it is our responsibility to protect and preserve that which has a sacredness to it. Stewardship of the environment has brought the idea of stewardship into popular understanding, but we also know that we're called to be stewards of our faith and in general, the resources or belongings that we have that we know are limited or that we know are tenuous. So when we break it down like this, there are two things that call us to become stewards of something. The first is when the thing being shared with us is limited, finite, or rare, and the second, when we recognize a sacredness present. The first is when the thing being shared with us is limited, finite, or rare, and the second, when we recognize a sacredness present. This summer, I have been keeping busy with a program called Clinical Pastoral Education, which means I am a hospital chaplain intern. I visit patients primarily on oncology and cardiovascular floors at a local Boston hospital. My second week into the program, I was finishing up with a patient when he turned to me and said, "Thank you. I am not able to share this story with many people." I was momentarily taken aback, surprised because in his story I heard ghosts of the dozens of other stories I had heard in my first 2 weeks on the job. Nothing here felt particularly out of the ordinary. All week long, people had been sharing with me stories about the many highs and lows of their careers, about how their illness impacts their life and relationships, about their fears as well as their hopes. And then it dawned on me. It was not that this patient had told a story all that different from the other patients that I visit with. It was just that this patient called to my attention that all those stories that I had been entrusted with were sacred stories. And where there is sacredness, there is a quiet call for stewardship. It was only then that I realized that with every story we're invited into, with each new thing that someone confides in us about, we reach a fork. We have a decision to make. We can be a steward of that story, or we can treat it plainly and typically. And it is so devastatingly easy to treat a story plainly. It is what I had been doing my first 2 weeks on the job, to be sure. Being a steward of someone's story means that we have to protect it against our impulses to share it with someone else, against the way our judgments softly erode the story's edges, against our tendencies to use the story to pigeonhole, reduce, or essentialize the person who told it, against even our tendency to think, usually several days later, that we know exactly what that story is about, first word to last word, with no more help from the storyteller. We have to continue to treat it with reverence and respect, and this is hard work. Hard spiritual work, in fact, and work that we will all have to keep reminding ourselves of and practicing day by day by day. I invite you to reflect on a time when your own story has been held in tenderness by someone, on a time that you couldn't believe that someone had remembered the details of your story long after it had been told to you, or a time that someone met you with impossible understanding and empathy, the act of which itself brought healing. Maybe they held it in confidence and trust in a way that brought you into deeper fellowship. How did that encounter feel? What did they do that made it so memorable? Mary Clark Moschella, professor of pastoral care at Yale Divinity School, writes, "There is a blessed relief that comes from feeling understood and known by another." When was the last time that you felt this blessed relief? I had the privilege this April of attending the Mid-America Regional UU Assembly in St. Louis, Missouri, in order to do some recruiting for BU's School of Theology. We had the pleasure of being joined in St. Louis by Reverend Leslie Takahashi, the senior minister at Mount Diablo UU Church in Walnut Creek, California, and the chair of the UUA's Commission on Institutional Change. In the plenary session, Reverend Takahashi offered recommendations for congregations and the denomination at large to better live into our promise to be truly multicultural. She was in the middle of this list when all of a sudden she paused to ask a rhetorical question. "And after all this," she said, "what about the people who told us their stories and we didn't keep them in any meaningful way?" Being a steward of someone's story does not only mean treating it with reverence and respect. Once it has been entrusted to us, it's part of our story now. We now know that there is someone out there with this particular lived experience, and we cannot pretend otherwise. We have to let the stories of others do work on us. One day at the hospital this summer, as I was rounding on my floor, I entered into a room of a patient that I had visited a few times before. The patient disclosed that he was going home that day. I had been a part of the discharge celebration with patients many times before, so I responded, "You must be so excited," with a smile. The patient heard me but didn't match my smile or my eagerness. And so, reading his changed body language, I asked, "Are you excited? Do you feel ready to go home?" He responded that he didn't. His medical state still felt tenuous, and the nurses and doctors had been taking such good care of him there. He was worried he wouldn't know how to take care of himself in the same way once home, or that he might miss something important. At home, answers to his questions were not available at a push of a button anymore, and he was nervous. Although 95% of the time patients were thrilled to go home, I now had evidence that discharge did not always mean uncomplicated celebration. And if I was going to let this story do work on me, I had to adjust my questions in the future. I could no longer assume, and instead I had to ask, do you feel ready to go? As Unitarian Universalists, we believe that the only proof that you need to back up a claim is the truth of your own lived experience. As such, it is part of our spiritual and part of our theological heritage to not just treat each other's stories as tales, but to treat them as truth, at least as truth with a little t, as having some significant part of the truth. What about the people who told us their stories and we didn't keep them in any meaningful way? When we see stories as sacred, we often begin to see that it took a certain holy courage to share with us. Activist poet Laura Hershey writes, "Those with power can afford to tell their story or not. Those without power risk everything to tell their story and must." These kinds of stories often sound something like, "No, I didn't learn that lesson in the same way." Or, "No, I don't experience that place as good and safe like you do." Or, "This Mother's Day, or this Christmas, or this anniversary was not that thing for me anymore." Or maybe even, "I can't afford to believe in that because the stakes are too high." We are let in on these perspectives, on these sacred stories constantly, whether we notice them as such or not. All around us swirls the complexity that we as human beings crave. All around us swirls the building blocks for the bigger picture that we yearn for. On living in a world comprised of billions of stories, Pastor Rob Bell teaches, you are always one question away from really good content. I suspect that all of us here today have stories that we are naturally good stewards of. Stories that did not directly happen to us, but that we have claimed as our own. These are often the stories of our families of origin. We integrate what we know of where our ancestors grew up, the conditions that they endured, the decisions that they made, and the world that they were born into our own life stories. We might feel protective of them. We might relay them to others with the level of detail as if we actually lived through them ourselves. In doing so, we are initiating our connection to what Macrina Weidecker calls the hint of eternity within. In each of us rests a hint of eternity that connects us to those who came way before us and those who will come long after us. Our seventh UU principle, respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part, nudges us toward expanding this definition of family. Nudges us toward noticing that that hint of eternity connects us not just to family, but to humanity. That our ancestors are not just those of a shared family line, but all those who walked before us and paved the way for us through discovery and invention, through setting up political and economic systems, and through dismantling and rebuilding those same systems and championing new causes. Through their advancements in science, art, ethics, mathematics, policy, justice, and peace building. When we notice that we are entangled not just in the legacies of our own biological family, but the legacy of our shared global family, then we are honoring our UU principle of interdependence. What would it look like to steward not just our stories and our family stories, but also these stories? What would it look like to try to honor that hint of eternity in us day by day? Each week we write candles of joy and concern from the backmost pew in the sanctuary, and then during what I consider to be the heart of the service, we knit them together, joy by joy and sorrow by sorrow, with the refrain from the hymn Sanctuary. And in our own uniquely Unitarian Universalist rendition, we sing to each other with thanksgiving, I'll be a living sanctuary for you, changing the meaning of the last line from the Christian, I'll be a living sanctuary for you, God, to the you, I'll be a living sanctuary for you, my beloved community. And in doing so, we are covenanting to be good stewards of each other's stories, covenanting to recognize the sacredness in the story, to then do the hard spiritual work of protecting it from being changed, misshared, or distorted once with us, to then hold it in meaningful ways, to neither claim it as our own, nor allow ourselves to forget that it has been lived as such, and to think of it not just as tale, but as part of the truth, even if it challenges our own. This is our charge, and this is our promise, to be living sanctuaries for one another, stewards, keepers, and refuges for one another. And in acknowledging the impossibility of the task, may we hold our covenant in one hand with seriousness and in one hand with lightness. May it be so. Blessed be, and amen. There is a blessed relief that comes from feeling understood and known by another. This is our promise, to be living sanctuaries for one another, stewards, keepers, and refuges for one another. And may we hold close to us the spiritual bottom line at the end of the day. Do others feel loved in your presence? The service begins when the service ends. Go in peace.
Where you go, I will go, beloved. Where you go, I will go. Where you go, I will go, beloved. Where you go, I will go. 'Cause your people are my people. Your people are mine. Your people are my people. Your divine, my divine. Where you go, I will go, beloved. Where you go, I will go. Where you go, I will go, beloved. Where you go, I will go. 'Cause your people are my people. Your people are mine. Your people are mine.
Please visit ascboston.org for more information about this historic Unitarian Universalist congregation. Arlington Street Church, gathered in love and service for justice and peace.